Thank you for joining the chat, Mr. Yu. So, you served as Singapore's diplomatic missions for many years, and between 2004 and 2011, you were the country's foreign minister. So, please tell us what you recall of your first interactions with your Chinese counterparts. Have you noticed any differences between them and other countries' diplomats regarding their working style?
I believe my first visit as a minister to Singapore was in 1990 with Lee Kuan Yew. And I was a young minister at the time, and it was interesting watching him interact with Chinese leaders, both in the center and in the provinces. During that trip, we went to Xinjiang, we went to Urumqi.
Right.
It was very interesting for me because it was the first time I saw China as an official. I must say that the Chinese side treated the Singapore delegation very graciously and very respectfully. But that was partly because Lee Kuan Yew at that time was important to China. In some ways, China studied the Singapore model with great interest, partly to see what we have achieved, partly also to see what mistakes we had made. And in 1991, when Deng Xiaoping went on this Nanxin and at Zhuhai said that in social management, China should try to overtake Singapore, there was a flurry of visits by Chinese officials to Singapore to study Singapore. It's like 农业学大在工业学大进，社会管理学新加坡。
Right. Literally, in English, it's learn Dajai, which is an industrial, an agricultural town, right, in northeast China. And when it comes to industry, we should learn Daqing, the oil field, also in northeast China. And then learning from Singapore, it's like what you said.
Social management.
Right, social management.
Yes. So in a sense, China was also interested in Singapore. So my first visit was a very happy one, a very interesting one. But since then, I've been to China many, many times. And during my 23 years in government, I visited China maybe dozens of times.
Right.
My first visit was in 1993 as a Minister for Information and the Arts. And there my host was a Chinese Minister for Radio, Television, and Broadcasting, Ai Zhisheng. And it was a very interesting visit for me. I always learn a lot when I visit China, both to see China's development and to see its implications on Singapore's own development.
At that time, we should learn from you, right? Especially in the 1990s.
Well, there was great interest by China in Singapore at that time in say industrial management. And between the Chinese and Singapore sides, we had the Suzhou Industrial Park, which was directly negotiated by Lee Kuan Yew on our side.
Right.
It became a great success, although there were initial difficulties. But since then, China has streaked ahead, and in more areas, Singapore has to learn from China.
You've been, too humble to say that. Well, it is generations of diplomats who have presented the country's foreign policy through their daily work. And in your observation, how has China's diplomatic philosophy evolved, especially since its reform and opening up in 1978, when you were still in your 20s?
The Chinese diplomats, both in foreign affairs and in economic affairs, have advanced rapidly in their self-confidence, in their mastery of languages, and in their command of the subject. In the years when I was Minister for Trade and Industry, Chinese trade officials negotiated in English, which really put them at a disadvantage if they did not command the language well. But to negotiate through interpreters is never satisfactory. By that time, I noticed that Chinese economic diplomats had no difficulty at all negotiating in English. That, to me, was very impressive. And today, the spectrum of Chinese competence in international affairs has broadened considerably. And not only in government, but also in the media field, like CGTN. It's been quite something to watch for a distant observer like me.
What about the country's diplomatic philosophy involvement? Have you noticed any, changes there?
The Chinese method of diplomacy is to concentrate on common areas of interest, to minimize problems, to solve problems, and to look for win-win propositions. There is no wish by China to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. And to me, this is a fundamental difference between China and other major powers like the European powers and America. China's view is, I have enough problems running my own country. I know you have problems in your country. Good luck to you. If I can help you, I will. But good luck to you. I'm not going to get involved in your affairs because I have enough problems with mine. Whereas with the Western powers, because they were used to being so dominant in the world, they have a strong tendency to judge other countries. You can almost imagine them when they visit countries like Singapore and maybe China with a clipboard, like a teacher, giving marks for various things, which to me is not very wise because you should never put yourself in that position. It doesn't make for good relations. And secondly, you should be aware that there are many things you do not know, and that conditions in those countries are very different from conditions in your own countries. If you cannot solve the problems in your own countries, you may not be able to solve problems in other countries. So I prefer China's approach that let's concentrate on how we can be helpful to one another, be a friend, don't be a troublemaker. And where core interests are involved, let's find a way to minimize problems, find solutions, and work for common positive outcomes.
And looking back over the 75 years that China has gone through, so what major diplomatic achievements do you think China has made since the founding of the People's Republic? And again, especially after the country's reform and opening up.
Well, ever since the 19th century, when the Qing dynasty was in decline, China has been trampled upon by the imperial powers, by the Western powers, by Japan. And Chinese people felt humiliated and very frustrated because they found it so difficult to transform themselves. And this process goes back to Xinghai Geming, to the Republican Revolution.
Right.
Its principal agenda was to get rid of the institutions of imperial China and liberate women and create a rule of law. And in those initial years, China tried to adopt Western institutions. It was not till Mao Zedong, leading the Communist Party, established a new path for China into the future. And when we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the People's Republic. It is celebrating China finally finding its own way to the future.
Right.
Still learning from others, but relying on its own history, its own cultural wisdom to find a way forward. And despite that, there were twists and turns in the 50s and 60s, but finally China has found a way to rapid progress and is now well on its way to becoming the world's foremost economic power. And it was not till Mao Zedong, leading the Communist Party, established a new path for China into the future. And when we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the People's Republic, it is celebrating China finally finding its own way to the future.
Right.
Still learning from others, but relying on its own history, its own cultural wisdom to find a way forward. And despite that, there were twists and turns in the 50s and 60s, but finally China has found a way to rapid progress and is now well on its way to becoming the world's foremost economic power.
Then what would you say are the major diplomatic achievements China has made over the 75 years, or the most pivotal achievement in your eyes?
Well, China decided that as it grew, it should not itself become an imperial power like others when they grew, like Japan. So this year, China celebrated the 70th anniversary of the Five Principles, which is very important, which, among other things, respects the sovereignty of others, which pledges no interference,
Right.
which works for cooperation based on mutual benefit. And in today's world, these are the only principles that can work. If we go back to the past, where the strong dominates and the weak has no choice but to accept it, then we will forever be locked in strife, in conflict, and in unhappiness. So what China is proposing is something which many countries in the world now see as their only way into the future, not only for themselves, but for the entire world.
Then when it comes to foreign relations, what would you say were the milestone events that have had or are expected to have far-reaching implications in China's diplomatic history?
Well, when China established the People's Republic, it was very close to the Soviet Union and received the help of the Soviet Union.
Right.
But Mao Zedong was always independent. So the establishment of the Five Principles, participation in Bandung the following year, and the rupture with the Soviet Union were all important milestones in setting China onto a separate journey into the future. But we had the interruptions of the Great Leap Forward, the famine, the Cultural Revolution, many twists and turns as China was still ridding itself of its past while trying to feel its way into the future. So the big transformation came in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping took China onto a new direction of reform and opening up. But Deng Xiaoping could only do that because the foundations of an independent People's Republic had already been laid. So each leader built upon the work, the successes of previous leaders. And after Deng passed away, new leaders in turn took China onto new heights. And today, to a point where China's growth is being viewed with great concern by many many major powers in the world, who fear that China will seek domination the way they sought domination when they grew.
Indeed, there are a lot of key moments in the development of China's history when it comes to foreign policies. And you've already named some key ones in the 1960s, 70s. Then moving into the 21st century, what would you say are the key milestones? I understand that there are a lot of them, but if you have to name like 2 or 3 of them, what would you pick?
Well, the Belt and Road Initiative, announced by Xi Jinping in Astana, I think it was in August 2013, then in Jakarta in October 2013, I think was very important.
All right.
The Belt and Road signal a new phase in China's development, where the development of the Chinese market and of the Chinese economy could help neighboring countries, near and far, also achieve development. This is not the first time it has happened. Every time China was ascendant, its prosperity brought prosperity to a very wide region around China. And naturally, trade flow, routes were established, all kinds of arrangements were made. So this was the old Silk Road, which was why the Belt and Road Initiative was initially patterned after the old Silk Road, both overland and at sea. But it's much more than that now. If China is developing, then its neighbors will also want to develop in alignment with China to reduce cost of transportation, to facilitate urban development, and to ensure that the national plans dovetail into one another for mutual benefit. And the Belt and Road Initiative is not a plan, it's not a strategy. It is really an organic outcome of the growth of China's economy spilling over into a much wider region. And in some directions, there could be initial obstacles. In others, it would move rapidly. But the general direction is, however the river meanders, it will still find its way to the sea. And we see that happening year by year in a very magnificent, in a very profound way.
Then do you think this Belt and Road Initiative launched in 2013 actually redefined China's role in international economic and foreign relations, or is it just some deja vu, or history repeats itself?
No, it creates new challenges. Along the Belt and Road, countries which are China's neighbors feel a greater dependence on China. But even though they're happy with the economic benefits, they also worry that this may give China too much leverage over them. So naturally, the countries that benefit the most from the Belt and Road, they want diversification. They want to be not completely dependent on China, but to have alternatives. This is a very important psychology. Now, I tell my American friends, the Americans oppose the Belt and Road because they think that it is at their expense. I tell them that it's the opposite. Along the entire Belt and Road, every country that sees its account with China growing will want diversification and will welcome America as they would Japan and India and Europe without having to pay for the Belt and Road. So you become a free rider. But it will be some time before the Americans come to this point of view, although eventually I think they would. And China understands this. China knows that the Belt and Road is not only to benefit China. In the end, it will benefit everybody, and it will make for a more interdependent, a better, and hopefully a more peaceful world.
But some argue, especially those in the West, that China is actually trying to challenge the existing world order and expands its own sphere of influence. Is it fair to say so?
Well, I can understand this point of view because the Western powers are so used to being dominant, are so used to controlling the international institutions, that when they see a China getting bigger coming in and wanting a commensurate stay in the councils of the world, they resent it. You're an interloper. Why are you here? You're not supposed to be here.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't like it. And it will take them some time before they accept it. And this is the reason why there is so much anti-China propaganda going on in the Western world. Some of it is state-directed, but some of it is a natural reaction to China's rapid rise, which they are not used to, and which threatens their own sense of self and superiority.
Right, and actually, some other major milestone or major events in China's foreign relations is described as brokering, peace in the Middle East, right? Brokering relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, rivals for decades. And then we see 14 Palestinian factions striking a landmark reconciliation deal in Beijing. So, from your perspective, were you surprised at that time that China was able to do all these? And how was it that China helped facilitate these peace talks and not other countries?
I was not entirely surprised.
All right.
And I believe that in the future, China can do much more.
Okay.
The reason is because China's statecraft is not based on zero-sum. It's based on win-win. The Western powers are entangled with the Middle East because when the Ottoman Empire fell after the First World War, between the French and the British, they carved out the old Ottoman realm.
Mm.
And later, when the British withdrew from east of Suez, they handed control over many parts to America, which is why the US has so many bases in the Middle East, in Diego Garcia, in the Persian Gulf, in the Mediterranean.
Mm.
So what we see today, American entanglement with the Middle East and European entanglement, is a result of history. And they carved out a part of the old Ottoman Palestine for the state of Israel. This was British policy. And not surprisingly, the Arab world feels that it was unfair because land was taken from the Palestinians. But China's view is history has its own logic and its own dynamic, and you cannot ignore history.
Right.
And China always sought, on the basis of the 5 principles, to work to mutual benefit. So China was able to work together with Saudi Arabia, with Iran, with Egypt, with the Palestinian government, even with Israel, on the basis that we have certain principles, we don't interfere, we are not a troublemaker, we are a peacemaker. So when conditions are right, China becomes the only one who has links to all the other powers. And that's how China was able to broker this agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Mm. And more recently, to even broker an agreement among the different Palestinian options in China, which was also a very good achievement. Right. But China can do it because it doesn't seek to interfere. It seeks to find common ground. Whereas the Western powers have a preferred outcome. So therefore, they weigh in on one side more than the other, and therefore not seen to be objective, and therefore harder for them to play that role.
And from a veteran diplomat's point of view, was it an easy job to do that? To broker such a deal?
Oh, no, it's never easy. To broker such a deal, you need to establish trust. You need to understand every country, its concerns, its history, its fears, its hopes, and then gradually to bring the two sides together, to encourage them to see good and reasonableness in the other. and then where it's necessary for China itself to add something onto the table,
Right.
to sweeten the agreement for all parties. And China can do that because China has many capabilities. And if there's peace, China can do a lot to build infrastructure, to bring investments, to open markets to everybody.
Right. Then let's move on to the challenges ahead. You once anticipated Asia's role to grow more significantly in a world in transition, with China enjoying greater prominence and influence on the world stage, and the balance of power shifting towards it. What makes you so confident in that? Could the opposite scenario take place?
Well, the Americans, after the end of the Cold War, thought it was a unipolar world, with America becoming the new Rome. But of course, that was a pipe dream. And the world is becoming multipolar. Yes, Deng Xiaoping once said that if China behaves like a hegemon, then it's the duty of other countries to bring down China. But I don't think this is how China sees itself. China is homogeneous. China is 92%, if not more, Han people.
Right.
China likes its homogeneity. I don't think China wants Beijing and Shanghai or Guangzhou to be like London or Paris or New York. A few foreigners, yes. But to have a polyglot society like what we see in the West will make China ungovernable. So if China becomes imperial, it will absorb large populations into its body politic, which it doesn't want. And that's why China believes deeply in the five principles, because it's the best way for China to maintain its own sense of self and to have harmonious relations with its neighbors. I mean, China will, of course, defend itself and defend its core interests, but its overwhelming preference is always for win-win outcomes, which is why it prefers always to use economic leverage, both carrots and sticks, in preference to military power. Military power is a deterrence, yes, but China, from the beginning, from Sun Tzu Bingfa, prefers not to have to make use of military force.
When you say economic leverage, in the narrative of some Western countries, it would be interpreted as economic coercion. Would that be a big problem if China uses too much often?
Well, economic coercion gives it a very sinister color. No, what China is saying is, hey, if we have good relations, then we can benefit each other economically. But if we have bad political reactions, then naturally this will affect economic relations, and you will suffer, I will suffer, China will suffer less.
Right.
Because China is a big economy, but you will suffer more. So throughout China's history, China has used the size of its economy as a way to manage its neighbors, as a preferred method of statecraft in international affairs. I don't think in this regard China has changed. And this is only possible because of the homogeneity of the Chinese population and because of the size of its internal economy and its internal market.
Right, then in this transition era, what would you say are the primary challenges for China's diplomacy in this changing international landscape, particularly regarding its relationships with Western powers?
Well, they feel threatened because they were used to dominating others, and in a sense, patronizing others. And now countries in the South, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, have alternatives. And China is an important alternative to them. And this, as it were, undercuts the position of the West in the South, and they don't like it. But I believe it is a phase. You take, say, the case of the Europeans in Africa. The Europeans know that if Africa's economy doesn't function, then the outflow of African refugees into Europe will be unstoppable. It's already bringing to European societies almost unbearable tensions. And if one economy after another in Africa falters, what we see now will only be a little of what is to come. China is now providing Africa's infrastructure for the 21st century, a way which was not imaginable before. China is a huge opportunity for Africa. And really, Europe and Africa, Europe and China, should work together to bring development to Africa. Africa doesn't belong to Europe. Africa doesn't belong to China. But if Africa works with both China and Europe, Africa will benefit, Europe will be protected, and China will benefit. There's so much advantage in peace. Now, America's agenda is a bit different because America will not face the problem of migration from Africa directly. It will still face this problem indirectly. There's also a significant African American population in America who want to see Africa develop, because if Africa cannot develop, they will feel inferior. Just as Chinese overseas felt inferior when China was being trampled upon by other powers. So African Americans want Africa to succeed. So to some extent, all of us want Africa to succeed, and we should cooperate to help Africa succeed, rather than think that Africa belongs to one party or the other.
Then how would you expect the relationships between China and Africa to evolve in the decades to come? Will it become more harmonious, or will it be interrupted by some noise? I mean,
No, there'll be a lot of challenges.
all right.
Because African society will have to be modernized. The boundaries in Africa were drawn by the colonial powers. In almost every African country, tribal affiliations are still very strong, which means that democratic institutions do not work very well. And when the armies intervene, they create new problems. So Africa cannot depend on Western institutions to develop. And this was said as much by the former president of Nigeria, a very respected leader, Obasanjo. He said, let us be frank. He said this recently. Let us be frank, he said. Western institutions don't work in Africa. Chinese institutions will not work in Africa. Like China, Africa must find its own path into the future.
Indeed.
Africa is 3 times the size of China in land area. Different parts have different histories, different cultures. And each country must find its own way. They will face challenges. There will be coups, there will be social upheavals. But in the end, we should help them work out the internal problems and find a way forward. That's all we can do. We cannot be the author of Africa's future, but we can certainly play a helpful role. We should definitely not play a destructive role.
Indeed. And the Sino-US relationship is arguably China's most consequential bilateral relationship. You've already touched upon it to some extent, but do you expect the coming decade to become the most challenging period Chinese diplomats will have to face?
There is a growing sense of insecurity in the US about itself. They worry that they could be in decline. But they have faith in the ideals of the American Republic. So America is now going through a very significant internal struggle to find its way into the future. America was created by immigrants from Europe. The blacks went there as slaves. Other communities coming in, Asians, and they will soon be in the majority. And the institutions are changing because of this demographic change. And the assumptions which created America and made it the greatest power on earth, those assumptions are breaking down.
Mm.
So the struggle within America today is a very profound one and will affect all of us in the world. You know, if America goes into decline, it will have repercussions even greater than the decline of the Qing dynasty on its neighbors, or the decline of the Roman Empire on Europe.
Mm.
Unfortunately, or fortunately, we are not part of this. But what happens in America will affect all of us, including US-China relations.
Right.
If the US were self-confident, I believe US-China relations will improve. But if the US feels increasingly unsure about its own future, it will worry more and more about China, and relations will get complicated. And this is a period that we've got to manage and help stabilize, because it is a dangerous period. It can lead to unnecessary conflict, even war.
Mm. In your anticipation, is it manageable?
I think it is manageable because China is not an aggressive imperial power.
All right.
If China were an aggressive imperial power, like the Soviet Union, that wishes to make others like China, that wants to export its ideology, its governmental structures, then a clash is inevitable. When the Europeans look at their own history, they talk about the Peloponnesian War and the Thucydides trap.
Yeah.
So it's impossible for them to think out of their own history. But China has a very different nature. And the more they understand China, the more they will realize that coexisting with China is entirely possible. And if we look at history, if we look at all the periods when China was the dominant power in Asia, whether it was during the Han Dynasty or Tang Dynasty or Song or Ming or Qing, China coexisted with other powers because it protected itself. It did not see profit in imperial adventures, and therefore its statecraft was always defensive. Such a China, America, and other powers should be able to live with.
Mm.
It's not inevitable that there will be conflict. I think it's possible to have an equilibrium where there is some tension, but where there is also constructive engagement and economic cooperation for mutual benefit.
Mm. Yeah, we look forward to minimum possibility of a war between, China and the States or the West in a whole, in general. Then to the relations with Southeast Asia, China has maintained stable relations with ASEAN countries, including Singapore, right, as they become increasingly important to each other in fields like trade and investment, regional security, and environmental cooperation. But there have also been some frictions, especially in the South China Sea area. So what kind of diplomatic efforts do you think are needed to fix such problems?
The integrity and unity of ASEAN is very important to China. If ASEAN loses its internal coherence, then every major power will have to get involved in ASEAN's internal politics. And this will create new tensions, a new arena of contest in the world. But if ASEAN stays united, if ASEAN stays neutral and friendly to all major powers, that is the best position for China, because China has enough problems of its own. And I was witness to the framework agreement for a free trade agreement between China and ASEAN, signed in Cambodia in 2002,
right,
between ASEAN leaders and Premier Chu Rong-chi. And I remember what Chu Rong-chi said. He said, China does not seek for itself an exclusive position in Southeast Asia. In other words, China desires ASEAN's friendship, but ASEAN is free to have as many friends as it wants to have. But please take into account China's core interests and don't harm China. Of course, ASEAN will take into account China's core interests. And of course, China has no desire to harm, ASEAN has no desire to harm China. So the big equation, I think, is favorable. Yes, there are problems in the South China Sea. China has worked out practical arrangements with Brunei, with Malaysia. And therefore, the South China Sea has never been a big issue between them and China. China now has good relations with Vietnam, even though China occupies more islands in the spread list than China. The current problem is with the Philippines. I think these are relatively small problems which can be resolved, managed by negotiations. And the Philippines stand to benefit much more by having good relations with China than bad relations. The US, of course, has deep historical links to the Philippines. And many Filipinos like America. Many Filipinos want to be American, but they're also nationalistic. And the business community knows that there's much more benefit in working with China than against China. The US may be able to support the Philippines militarily, but economically, the Philippines stand to benefit much more from China than from the US. So I believe if we're able to prevent conflicts on the ground from boiling over and have people at higher levels meeting to look at the big picture, I think the problems in the Philippines can be managed. But if they are not, and if people die, then a small problem becomes unnecessarily big. Whereas our responsibility is to try to make problems small. And here, ASEAN should play.
Then, on the Chinese side, do you think there is anything more that we can do? You know, if you have, if you're more capable, you can obviously do much more, right? Have we done, you know, enough explanation? Maybe our stance is not totally comprehended by the Philippine side. Do you think what we can do, you know, Beijing can do more probably?
Well, I can't comment specifically because I do not know many of the details.
All right.
Some of it will be confidential. But China's general approach towards Southeast Asia, especially over the South China Sea, should be a generous one.
Okay.
Why do I say this? China's claims are not weak. The 9-dash line has a history which goes back to the period before many countries in Southeast Asia were independent. So they feel that it was unjust that their predecessor colonial powers, the Americans, the British, and the French, did not protect their interests. They say, how could it be that China's territorial waters come all the way to our horizon? So if China were to put itself in the position of this country, then you say, well, I understand why they feel this way. I'm not saying that China's claims are weak. In fact, I publicly say that China's legal claims are not weak. But the approach should be not 50-50, but depending on the country, it can be 60-40, it can be 70-30. On fisheries, it can even be 80-20. On oil and gas, it could be 70-30, whatever. But find a way so that the other party feels, yeah, this is a fair arrangement. Now, to be sure, no one can give up his claim. The Philippines can give up its claim. China can give up its claim. So these claims should be set aside. And let us talk about economic benefits,
Right.
about fishermen, and find a way to develop a positive agenda so that everyone thinks that there's much more to be gained by cooperation than by endless dispute over a zero-sum matter. So because China is bigger, China is richer, I think China should always take a generous approach.
I think the whole world, I can't say for this whole world, but we obviously look forward to that. Well, last question. You said you...
But let me add one point.
All right.
Yeah. But if an ASEAN country decides that it should strengthen its position by bringing in another external power, like the US, hoping that that external power can pressure China, then what should China's response be? I think China's response is an obvious one, which is to tell that country, the more you pull in external power, the tougher my position will be. But if you don't involve external power and just keep it as an issue between ASEAN and China, then China will be generous. I think this is a natural approach which China should take. Right.
I think all parties should understand what you just said. And last but not least, you've already mentioned, like we mentioned previously, Asia. You expected Asia to become more influential, with China enjoying greater prominence and influence in the global arena. But personally, do you look forward to such kind of world, and why?
No, we all want a world where we can stand tall, be ourselves. We don't want a world where we are colonized, where we are being judged, where we feel inferior. I don't think we want a world where the tables are turned and we bully others and we judge others and we treat them as if they were below us. I think it's a much better world if all human beings are spiritually equal, compete, but understand that in a crisis, this is the only boat we have, this is the only planet we have, and we've got to survive together. And I believe such a philosophy is something the world badly needs in the 21st century. And if we are not able to achieve such a common understanding of our human destiny, then we'll be condemned to eternal conflict. The problem is technology now enables us to destroy the world many times over. So it cannot be rational for us to think like that. We have no choice but to move into a different kind of world.
Right.
A world based on a mutual acceptance of a common humanity.
So you're saying that a world with Asia being more influential is such a world?
No, where Asia makes its contribution to the world.
Right.
And a world where Europe continues to make its contribution, and where America is healthy and a friend. I think that's the world that we want. I don't think we want a world where we are well off and others are in trouble. Because if they're in trouble, their troubles will become our troubles.
This is CGTN Radio. Hear the difference.